Hello, world. Welcome to Speed Strength Show. I'm Tommy.
And I'm Christian. And if you had to eat one type of food for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Oh, I've actually been asked this question before,
Oh,
so I
really?
feel like I think I had this conversation. I was at practice actually at the U of A one time. I think this is where it came up with the jumps group. I'll let you guess who brought it up in that group, but my answer was quinoa.
Oh, see, we're on different pages here. So not a specific thing of like ground beef, quinoa,
Oh,
rice.
okay, that's what
I'm
we were
talking
talking about, like
about
one food.
one food. So like pizza could be an example. Where
Oh,
it's
and then
like
you can put whatever you want
everything,
on the pizza.
yeah, but it has to be a pizza. So it has to satisfy the criterion of
Correct here.
being a pizza or being a taco or a salad. Like it's got to satisfy
Yeah.
certain
Oh, okay.
what
All
makes
right.
it
Okay.
it.
Yeah, so this is different then. Yeah, we were talking about one food, and the common answers were quinoa and potatoes. Those were
Also,
the
the fact
two
that
that
you're
came
gonna
up.
eat quinoa for the rest of your life and only
I don't,
quinoa.
I don't want to, but it was like one specific food that you had to pick. So I was like, well, to me, it's one of the most. It's a plant, so it's got something like that. It's got complete proteins. It's got carbs. It's got whatever. I was like, all right, I could probably last the longest on a deserted island if I'm eating nothing but quinoa over like a banana or something. So, okay, what do you count as like a bowl? Like, 'cause
Like
I'm
a
thinking
rice bowl.
like a taco bowl, a rice bowl, a sushi bowl. I'm a big fan of bowls because then you don't have to like waste the time of making tacos. You just throw it all in a bowl and mix it up. You
And you
don't,
just eat.
yeah, you don't make sushi. Just throw it all in a bowl and mix it up. But I don't know if that's like a type of food.
Because anything could go in a bowl, so it has to be a specific type of bowl. Like if you just say a sushi bowl, like you'd have to have rice. You'd have to have some form of raw fish.
Okay, what's your classification for a salad? Because now I
It's
think I'm just gonna
the
make salads.
the
I'm gonna make a
primary
sushi salad
base
and a
has to
taco
be
salad.
some sort of green lettuce.
Oh,
Not
done.
green lettuce, but green
I'm,
leafy vegetable.
I'm picking salad then.
Just want salad.
Well, because then I'll make a taco salad. I'll make sushi salad. I'll make like I can make regular garden salads. You can put anything in a salad. If we're talking about you literally put anything on a bed of like greens, you're good to go.
You're gonna have a breakfast salad, Tommy.
Why not? That wouldn't actually be that bad. Now that I'm thinking about it, you could put like some scrambled eggs and veggies and toss it on. It's like the reverse. Instead of dicing up and chopping the spinach to put it in the scrambled eggs, you just put all the stuff from the scrambled eggs on top of the spinach.
You just
That
dicing your scrambled eggs to go on top of your spinach.
Well, the scrambled eggs are already kind of like they're all mucked up anyway. So you can just like, whatever, just take it right in the pan and toss it on a. That's what I think I would do. Yeah, yeah, that's what I would do.
Your body's a temple and it's got to be salad, eh?
Well, no, I'm just thinking it's the closest to the bowl because that's what I would want to do, like a taco bowl, sushi bowl, breakfast bowl, like whatever all those styles of food are. That would be probably my go-to. So I'm just thinking from a, you know, consistency, like what's then the closest thing to that satisfies the criteria you're putting forward to me because bowl doesn't count. So I'm like, all right, I'll skirt that and go with the salad.
That'd be the most hack ever. As long as it's in a bowl, it counts.
But
Can you eat
yeah,
literally anything as long as it's in a bowl?
cereal.
Can you imagine?
Yeah,
There's probably some
that's what I would
salad
go
out there.
with. That's what I would go
Salad.
with. Yeah.
Okay. I think I have to go with tacos. Both from like I love tacos. They're delicious.
Okay.
To the versatility is very high. So you get
Well, yeah,
all
you
these
can
different
change up what's in there.
you can change up what's in there. It's suitable for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You can make dessert tacos if you want something sweet. You got all these different types of tortillas. You have hard tacos, you have soft tacos, you have like the spinach and tomato taco tortillas,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you have yeah.
vegetables, also some good
Vegetables.
protein.
Okay, dessert taco. How are you making a dessert taco?
That wouldn't be that hard.
No, but like I'm just curious, what are you putting in it?
Ice cream. There's some cookies.
But you're using like a doughy, like wheat soft.
Oh, so you would fry the tortilla to give it a little bit of crisp, and then you'd put the dessert bits inside. the tortilla, it'd probably be pretty good.
So it's like a tortilla crepe.
Yeah. Or there you go. Boom, done. A little whipped cream, some sprinkles, maybe maple syrup because we're in Canada.
I love crepes. Oh, I mean, I don't think, yeah, that wouldn't be terrible. I think you're right. If you fried it, it would be weird if it was
Can't be
like the
cold.
soft serve, like the soft tacos that you just take right out of the bag. If you like tossed ice cream and stuff on that, I don't think that would be very good. But you're right. If you like fried it up, if it had some
Yeah, a little texture.
crisp to it, that would be, yeah. All right, yeah, that's a good. I could go with the. I could I could pick tacos too, but I'm gonna stick with.
Salad.
I'm sticking with the salad bowl.
Yeah, it's a tough one because I feel like not that salad's a tough one, but the question in general, because we want like pizza is always a go-to answer of like, oh, I love pizza. I couldn't eat pizza every day. That's cheese and bread every meal, every day.
That'd be too dense.
Oh, I feel like I have a gut every day for the rest of
Yeah,
my
and you
life.
wouldn't have like it, every meal is heavy,
Yeah.
even if you went thin crust. Like you,
Oh yeah, no, because there's cheese on it.
well, exactly. Yeah. So, and then also, I don't know. Like, do you have to have cheese for it to be a pizza?
Absolutely.
I would think so. I know you can get pizzas without cheese to do like a white or a red sauce, and then you toss whatever on. But to me, that's becomes like a flatbread
Yeah.
as opposed to like a true za where there's like the cheese and everything on it. And like, yeah, that would just be way too heavy.
No cheese on your pizza would make your Italian grandmother roll in her grave.
Exactly, which I don't have because I'm not Italian. But yeah, no, okay. So yeah, I'm sticking with the salad. I'm not changing. I don't know how I'm gonna make a dessert salad, but I'll cross that road when I get there.
Hey, Tommy, I'm not disappointed because your body's a temple and you might be the healthiest guy I know. So,
I just wanted the convenience. I wanted a bowl. Then I could have made a dessert bowl. Just throw whatever desserts in there, like crumble up some brownie, throw M&Ms in there, do whatever. Just have like a bowl of Halloween candy. Just start eating it with a spoon. That could have been my dessert. But I guess bowl doesn't count as a food. So
no,
that
the
was
bowl's the
a no-go.
vessel to eat the food out of.
Yeah, that's fair. So yeah, salad, taco. I'm glad no one picked pizza or hamburger
No, hamburger
or
is a hard
sandwich,
no.
whatever you want it. Yeah, too
Sandwich I could
boring.
see. Sandwich I could get away with. It's boring, but you could do it.
Yeah, uh, too much bread, too much
There's a
like
lot.
yeah, I couldn't do it. Could not do it.
I mean, let's be honest. A salad is just a sandwich without the bread.
Well, it depends what kind of salad I make. It could be a taco without the shell.
Every salad goes inside a sandwich.
Yeah, but I'm saying, what if I took like what you were gonna make for the tacos, and then I made it a salad? Then it's not a sandwich anymore. I could like crumple tortilla chips in there. Like, yeah, that's why I think the salad's versatile. I would go with that, and it's easy.
Yeah,
I like easy. I don't want to spend 50 years making food. So just take whatever out of the fridge, put it in a bowl, done,
it's got to be in a bowl. Can't eat salad on a
done,
plate.
done. Well, yeah, salad in a plate's just frustrating to deal with.
Going
So
everywhere.
yeah, no, I thought initially when you said one food, I thought it literally had to be like one ingredient.
Oh no, I don't think I
But
could
this
ever
is
decide on a single ingredient to eat the rest of my life. I can't make that decision. I like food too
yeah,
much.
no, that's fair. Obviously, you would never want to do that, but I'm glad this gave me more leeway to pick other things. But I was prepared. I was like, yeah, quinoa. Let's just survive here. Like, be alive.
The most obscure answer too is quinoa. I know so many people who have no idea what quinoa is, let alone that's their go-to answer of, oh yeah, one food, quinoa, done.
Well, no, there was obviously a lot of back and forth about
Yeah.
like what food had the most diverse like nutrient pool and other things like that because if you're only picking one ingredient you can eat. The big question mark became how long could I survive on a particular
Yeah.
ingredient?
It's more of
And
a desert
obviously
island.
the less diverse the nutritional value of the food is, probably the quicker you're going to kick the bucket.
You didn't want to do the carnivore diet, just ground beef every meal.
Nah, I had somebody else do that.
We ran that experiment. We know it doesn't end well.
Yeah, it doesn't work. I wouldn't want to do that. And I'm glad I didn't guinea pig that. So, you know what I am willing to experiment and play around with though?
What's that?
Training the foot.
Oh yeah, the foot is the first contact point with the floor. It's an important thing to train.
And depending on what you're doing, it's the only contact point. Unless you're crawling, right? Then your hands are on the ground. But, for the most part, yeah, the foot's important. And this is our first series together that we're going to do. So yeah, kind of going to do a deep dive into training the foot and I guess the ankle too, because to some extent the ankle moves with the foot and things like that. But yeah, we want to do a bit of a deep dive on the foot and the ankle. I know it's something you're paying more attention to in training. Certainly something I'm paying more attention to in training. I think I was guilty for the last 10 years of not really paying attention at all to it. Um, so yeah, like I'm super stoked to kind of dive deeper into this, figure out exactly what's happening at the level of the foot, what is it doing, and what are some of the ways we can assess the foot, what are some of the ways we can train the foot, and hopefully enhance performance of athletes that we work with or the health of athletes or clients or anything like that. What are the big takeaways in terms of practical applications from the foot? So yeah, I'm super stoked to dive into this and kind of figure out, what ideas are, going on one end of the country while we got different ideas going on the other end and kind of put them together and yeah, come up with some cool stuff.
Well, I'm excited about this. Like, and yeah, like the foot and the ankle, I feel like you can't talk about one without the other because there's so much connection between the different muscles from the ankle that just attach right to the foot. Like
Yeah.
they're almost not, they can't be mutually exclusive to each other. But I'm excited to get in this conversation because there's so much intricacy in these little movements that happen at the foot. But I feel like in the world of S&C, for the most part, not all of us with everyone, the foot is such an ignored piece in terms of any sort of nuance behind the conversation. Like when there's foot issues, it usually turns to calf and ankle training, or they say, "Oh, you're just a really big supinator. Let's do some towel crunches and call it a day." Like that always seems to be the conversation when you hear about people talking the foot, or like you said, people just go their entire careers and never even think about training the foot at all.
Yeah, well, that was going to be kind of like you touched on it initially. The big general overview of the foot is what I would say in most cases from a locomotion standpoint, the foot is our only contact point
Yeah.
with the ground. Again, if we're in a 4 point or a handstand or something like that, our hand becomes the contact point as either individually or in conjunction with the foot. But for the most part, every action, every movement we do goes through the foot. The foot is our contact point with with the ground. And the fact that every movement we do, and I'm going to say every movement we do because even I don't work with any sports right now where hands are on the ground. I work entirely with feet on the ground, even like throwing or something like that. It's
Yeah.
you're throwing the implement through the contact with your feet on the ground. So the fact that we train movements and athletes and actions that are always moving through the foot and the ground, and that the foot is an afterthought in our training, to me, like it
Yeah.
boggles my mind. And now I sit here and say for the last 10 years, I've been an idiot for ignoring the foot when, in reality, I probably should have been paying attention to it. And like you said, it's interesting. It's an absolute afterthought until there's an injury. Then all of a sudden the foot becomes super important and there's foot exercises and there's this and there's that. But we never think about the foot or I shouldn't say never, but we rarely think about the foot from a performance enhancing perspective. It always becomes it's a red flag once the foot is hurt. And then we talk about the foot, but we don't do much with it in general, which is surprising to me given how important the the foot is in terms of giving us stability and a means of locomotion through the ground. Like it boggles my mind. And I feel like an idiot for not paying more attention to it until the last like 4 months.
Well, no one really does, and that's the weird part, right? And I think it's one of those things, and I feel like there's just certain regions of the body that practitioners will tend to look at, and you almost cradle it a little bit and it's treated very delicately. The foot is one of them, and it's also like it's not sexy when we're talking about performance and what's driving. Like everyone wants like the glutes and the quads, the hamstrings, like these big muscles. You know, you got the
Big
gas
power
drop.
numbers, the big weight, like the explosive movements.
Yeah, things that globally, when you look at that's where you're seeing everything happen. Like there's an appeal to seeing something happen. When you're looking at the foot, you're usually in some sort of cleat or a spike or a plate or a running shoe. You don't see really much happen depending on what angle you're looking at it. And what's going like broadly in sport, you really don't look at the foot at all. I think that's partially of we want to look at things that we see very easily and readily and availably to say, oh, like look at the knee, look at the hip, they're changing this angle. But you can't see all the intricacies that are happening at the foot when they're making contact with the ground and propulsing off the foot or off the ground, sorry. So it's similar sort of idea of like you don't see it, you forget about it. And I think that just percolates all the way through as people go, oh, I can see all this stuff. It's way easily measured, way more easily measured,
Infinitely.
infinitely more easily measured. So I think that like that's the bias of everybody is like this is easy to see and see what happens and measure what happens. We're gonna focus on this. Whereas in like going through this deep dive of research for the foot, it's really tricky to measure. People aren't really sure exactly what's going on and what's doing what. The level of how much contributing, there's some gray area. How you train it, there's a lot of gray area because you look at a study of, oh, strength training the foot didn't improve performance, but they just did like towel crunches and toe raises. Well, that's not really training the foot either, right? Like that's
Yeah, it's a low level, like a very intro low level exercise. You're probably not getting a lot of adaptation. And I think, yeah, that's a great point. I didn't actually think about the foot being ignored because it's always trapped in shoes or footwear, and we tend to like out of sight, out of mind. Um, I think I've been guilty of having the foot as a like a passive training means
yeah,
where, hey, we're doing some low leg stuff, we're doing jumping, we're doing bounding, we're doing much, like some other things. You go, I'm getting all of these different things from this training adaptation, of this training modality, while the foot's being taken care of. Um, and so I think I've been probably guilty of that. And as I've dove further into the research, I think now I'm probably also guilty of not understanding very well how the foot works. It's super complicated. It's not a simple, it's not like a, one muscle connects here, attaches there. This is how it works, done. Like you're good to go. It's very complicated. And I think I probably go back to what I talked about last time in the weightlifting episode, where like if you don't understand it, you're probably not going to train it. You're probably not going to use that tool because you're not confident enough to use it. And I'm still not, like, by no means an expert on the foot in any way, shape, or form, but I have a better understanding of it right now than I did 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. And I'm more confident to at least try some things in terms of like putting it into training. But I'm guilty for the most part of largely ignoring the foot, either through a lack of understanding of what is actually happening at the level of the foot, and like you said, kind of out of sight, out of mind.
yeah, and it's one of those things that I feel like yeah, people say like, oh, we're doing plyos, the foot's being trained. We're doing plyos, like
Yeah,
the foot's
done.
being trained with it. I feel like grip
Box
strength is
check.
another one. We're doing deadlifts, we're doing heavy pulls. Your grip strength, you need to do extra grip strength stuff. Or if you're doing heavy lifts, you're training your core while you're doing heavy lifts, right? Like there's certain regions of the body that we just go, oh, what we're already doing checks that box. But there's a nuance to it, especially when you look at all this deep function that we'll get into of the foot in terms of the anatomy, how that anatomy works together to create function and propel yourself off the ground or propel yourself off an object. It's got a very unique, distinct function that will influence how we need to train it. And like when we think about sprinting, like over 4 times body weight's going through that foot.
And I think that's largely why we maybe ignore it.
Yeah.
Then we go, oh well, like, yeah, it's getting overloaded. We're training it. The tissues are going to adapt. But there are things that we could do to help move that adaptation in the right direction, and probably faster, as a result of both, call it the passive training and the active or purposeful training towards the foot.
Yeah. And in my mind, it functions very similar like maximal strength would, in the sense of this doesn't look anything like the sport. in terms of direct transfer of the sport, it actually has very little. But in terms of providing scaffolding to build skills upon and increase training load, huge, huge benefit from what I've come to kind of understand from researching the last couple months for sure.
Yeah, and I would agree with you on that. And yeah, I'm just disappointed I haven't paid more attention to it until now. And part of me is kind of shocked. I mean, I know, you know, Jim is not going to like this comparison, but if you think about a race car, um, one of the most important, and being a motorsport nerd, one of the most important things you have on the car is the tire.
Yeah.
Why is that? Because the tire is the only part of the car in contact with the ground. Every component of the car becomes effectively useless if you do not have the right tire on the vehicle. And so to me, the idea that as a, performance practitioner or whatever you want to call it, I've looked at the human body and gone, nah, the foot, whatever. Like that should have been the most important part. Like that's the only part in contact with the ground when you sprint or run or change direction or throw or apply force or whatever for 99% of the movements I work with. And so I'm a little bit disappointed. Like the race car nerd in me is a bit disappointed that I didn't make that comparison. But maybe I didn't make that comparison because I'm not trying to compare the human body to a machine. So maybe that was a good thing. I don't know. But yeah, like there's no doubt after reading some of the stuff and going through things and hearing other people speak that we got to pay attention to the foot. We got to pay attention to it.
When you talk about even biomechanics, right? Like that is the mediator between imparting force on the ground. And that's where the force comes back up, right? Like again, we focus on this hip and knee extension and ankle extension. It's like that's awesome. But like the force is going through a small section of the foot, like really the ball of the foot that's in contact with the ground.
Yeah.
That's where we're pushing into the ground. That's where the ground's pushing back into us. If that's weak and collapsing and doing all this weird thing because it doesn't have the structural integrity behind it to actually take or transfer the force down to the floor, like we're gonna lose so much performance there.
Yeah.
Or
Like
potentially could.
what is the point of a powerful hip or knee if the foot is not able to transmit or absorb
Yeah.
the force? Like it's effectively the weakest link, or it's the smallest link, so then therefore it could be the weakest link within that chain. And like you said, all the force that's being created at the hip and the knee needs to go through usually a very small part like the ball of the foot. And is that tissue, or those tissues, are those structures ready to tolerate, transmit, and absorb all the force? Well, I feel like that's probably on us to prepare people. So the answer is yes, we are prepared to do that.
Especially in off-season times where there's nothing but time to do training, right? Like that's a huge opportunity of like, hey, here's something to do at home, and here's something we're going to do in the gym. Like there's so many ways to skin that cat. But it's interesting going through the readings. No one seems to divide the foot in the same way, or maybe classify the foot in the same way. There seems to be sort of multiple classifications or multiple categories where some people are very general, like foot muscles. Some people break down the foot muscles into like different layers. You got your deep layers and your superficial, and then you got your intrinsics and extrinsics. In your readings, tell me what was the way that made sense for you? Like, how are you looking into the foot and going, okay, like makes sense in terms of dividing different groups or actors or layers of the foot muscles? Like, where did you end up finding yourself on that?
I think for me, one of I agree with you. The papers, yeah, all over the place. You get like highly specific, similar to like the hand when you look at the anatomy of the hand, and there's, yeah, superficial, deep, this, that. There's all kinds of stuff going on. For me, the idea of like, oh, low leg, foot, not comprehensive enough.
Mhm.
The idea of now breaking it down into like superficial layers and this and that and small functions within the foot, I think for us as practitioners probably overcomplicates things, and you might get a little bit paralysis by analysis because you're like, oh, well, wait, if I do this with you know, a superficial muscle, am I doing whatever for one of the deeper muscles? And
Your
then
fourth lumbrical isn't working quite enough. Like,
yeah, and now it's like that's not really, at least for me, my scope either. Like I'm not a
yeah,
clinician, so for me to do that. So kind of what I settled on was, I think, the intrinsic extrinsic. I think for us that is a good enough distinction as, individuals working with athletes from a performance standpoint, that is this training modality or tool I'm about to give you enhance the intrinsic muscles of the foot, meaning they originate and attach on the foot itself, so below the ankle. And so to me, that is directly training the foot.
Yeah.
Or is this a training modality that is going to train the extrinsic muscles, meaning the muscles in the low leg that then have connections and tendons attaching to the foot? So they still act on the foot through the ankle, but they are, to me, they're different, originating on the leg, attaching to the foot, or originating on the foot and attaching to the foot. And to me, it gave enough information that I could make some sound training decisions, but didn't overcomplicate things. And so to me, I think that's where I've settled on that being kind of the happy medium between the two.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I ended up in a similar place of like extrinsic with intrinsic muscle regions in general. Again, it's that nice balance between there's some nuance to the conversation, but it's
Yeah.
not going too far down the rabbit hole where maybe differentiating between the different muscles, the intrinsic muscles of the foot doesn't matter, right? Like you're not changing your training decisions. You're probably not making any tangible change by focusing on this nuance. The only thing I would maybe add to that would be incorporating like the big toe is a big conversation point where it's okay, there's intrinsic muscles that focus on the big toe a little bit more. And that seems to be a key piece is the big toe.
Yeah, I was going to dive a little bit more into that in part two, where
Yeah.
you can then kind of break up, is this working like the arch of the foot? Is this working the big toe or the digits? Is this, and to me, that's worth putting in, because then if you're putting, like, if you have 3 training days a week and you're going to put, oh, I'm going to put something in there for the foot each day.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this day I'm focused on a big toe exercise. This day I'm focused on a, um, you know, exercise for the bridge or the arch of the foot. And on the other day, I'm going to do, something that combines the foot ankle complex together, or something like that. But I agree with you. Yeah, those are distinctions I think worth making. Um, but yeah, I was just going to dive into that more in the second part where we talk about some of the actual training
Oh, totally.
modalities. But yeah, I agree with you that I think there's value there, especially the big toe. I don't think you realize how valuable the big toe is until you can't really use it.
Yeah.
And then you realize how much goes through the big toe when you're like, oh, it's swollen, or I have turf toe, or I have this, and then you can't walk, you can't run, you can't do anything. You're like, okay, yeah, the big toe is probably pretty important.
Well, and that's why I wanted, even as like like an anatomical structure of the foot, like we got the intrinsic muscles, you got the extrinsic muscles, and then beyond that, there's a couple big pieces that people tend to focus on. A lot of people talk about the like the medial longitudinal arch that we've kind of touched on already, and then yeah, like people talk about the big toe. The big toe is a huge focus. I had a runner; they had a toe arthritis. They can't do anything. Like they could do gym based activities, elliptical, bike, but beyond that, like they can do anything for weeks just because they had a
Yeah.
big toe, inflamed big toe. Nothing super major, just needed time.
Yeah, and it takes a lot away. And so yeah, I do think there's value in that type of stuff, like you said, from a kind of classification, or if you're building like a training inventory
Yeah.
of the foot. I think in this case, specifically, if you're looking at acting intrinsically on the foot, um, is this more arch
Yeah.
focused, or big toe focused, or digits, or something like that? I think there's value in that, because then it gives you decent variety of what you're doing, kind of like the hamstring. Maybe, okay, one day I'm attacking hamstring from the hip. On another training day, I'm attacking hamstring from the knee,
Yeah.
because I recognize that this muscle acts on different parts of the joints it's surrounded by in different ways. And I think in the foot, you can do some similar things. So that's how I have my, like, foot training progressions or classifications set up.
Yeah.
Is this a big toe, uh, big toe, forefoot, kind of bridge or midfoot, and then, or is it something that kind of ties everything together, where the foot and the ankle, low leg, are working in conjunction to do whatever.
When it seems like when you break, especially the intrinsic muscle of the foot, They definitely seem to divide into the two categories where it's, hey, these are more movement based muscles. They're controlling, toe digit function. They're targeting big toe function in terms of how it moves, or it's more around arch and foot stiffening, like force transfer, arch support, arch integrity, and control. Like it seems very much that the function of the muscles has this kind of two, not dichotomized, but two contrasting functions where these are focusing around movement of the toe and the foot and give it that proprioception and that malleability. And these give it the support and the stiffness and the rigidity that are, like we talked about, important for force transfer at the foot. It seems to be that way.
Yeah, and then when you look further into the kind of the anatomical structure, and I'm not big on, looking at anatomical structures and this and that, but it was interesting to look in the foot that you, as you're describing two distinct functions, you kind of get two distinct anatomical features within
Mhm.
within the foot. You get these long, very tendinous muscles,
Mhm.
right? In the sense, like you said, controlling the digits, controlling the toes, long, yeah, tendinous type structures,
Yeah.
which again you could see being good for, moving digits around and stuff like that. But then like in between some of the tarsals and things like that, you have very short, kind of compact, low pennation angle
Yeah.
muscles, which then if we know the lower the pennation angle, the more it acts on in line with the tendon. And those within the foot are very good at, like you said, being able to like stiffen and create rigidity. So you see these kind of short, compact, I don't want to say parallel because I don't know if they're stacked in parallel or series. That I
Yeah.
didn't dive that far into it. But I'm envisioning within the foot, then, if they're talking about these low pennation angle, short, compact muscles, I'm thinking of these kind of parallel stacked, designed for just hold the position that we need for the stiffness
Yeah.
versus the longer tendinous muscles, which, okay, I need to create movement and range in the digits. And so it makes you think, okay, again, do you train the muscle and the tissue towards its function? So do we need to think about the bridge of the foot? Okay, can I, create the isometric strength needed to have the structural integrity to transmit the force? And maybe if I'm training the big toe or the digits, do I need to find a different way to train that because I'm dealing with potentially different types of muscle contractions when I'm performing locomotive movements? I don't know, but this what was it? Uh, Ledoux, Ledoux and colleagues. It was an older study from like the early 2000s, but
Hmm.
they were looking at all the anatomical makeup of the
Yeah.
muscles of the foot, and that was interesting to see. Again, giving ideas of, okay, maybe I need to train this structure in that way to match the function, and then train these other muscles in a different way to suit towards their function.
When you see it in so many different settings in different regions of the body, right? Like these really highly pennated muscles are way more biased towards force production, whereas you're getting these less painted muscles, really long muscle bellies, really long tendons, where it's way more velocity of contraction or way more velocity, elastic kind of base movements or precision of movement.
Yeah,
Especially if you think with the fingers, like again, like really long tendons, really precise movements versus like the quadriceps, highly pennated, not necessarily super fast contraction velocities, but really high force production qualities in those muscles, right? Like it's interesting to see the nuance and but also the similarity between what you're seeing at the foot, where it's yeah, these compact, highly painted muscles, probably biased towards more force production than anything. And that's the role when we're looking at the sport of the arch and the sport of the foot, right?
and to touch on the arch, interesting because when there was I don't even know, I'm gonna butcher this last name, so apologies if the author of this paper is listening. Um, uh, Verkadison, Verkadison, Verkadison.
You tried.
This is the best three attempts I have. A paper from 2017 that this was a very theoretical paper, and they were looking at foot structures of other animals and other primates and things like that, and
Mhm.
comparing kind of to humans. And there was a little more, like I said, kind of like in theory,
Yeah.
this is how it works. And they had discussed how the longitudinal arch of the foot is really well studied. And now that I think about it, a lot of the exercises I have in my inventory for, call it midfoot or the arch of the foot, is biased to the longitudinal
Yeah.
aspect. And they were talking about, you have to remember that the arch isn't just a one dimensional, it's not just arched longitudinally, it's arched either medially or transversely, depending on how you want to look at it. And so one of the big takeaways from that paper was to not forget about the fact that the arch is in the other direction as well. And then they were citing some like mechanical structural theories of like, if you take a piece of paper that's flat but then you
Yeah.
arch it, it has more ability to resist force. Even though you haven't changed the thickness of the paper, the composition of the paper, it's still exactly the same. But as soon as it's arched in nature, it's better at force absorption and force production. It becomes a stronger structure overall, which then in theory makes sense why the arch of the foot is set up that way to resist, you know, changes in structure or position in order to help transmit force. But it got me thinking about, okay, what are some things that do we need to do in order to strengthen the arch transversely, or is all the medial, like the longitudinal stuff, does that take care of it as well? Like I'm this is again more in theory. D- Do they function separately? Do they function together? Is this like medial longitudinal arch? Does this become a whole like upper lower abs type thing where it's like, yeah, I don't really know if that matters that much. If you're training the muscle, you're going to get the adaptation. Like, do we need to think about that? Is it? I'm guessing they would all be active together, but I don't know. Like, if you came across anything that discussed maybe the biases towards longitudinal versus transverse or medial, whatever you want to call it.
In my mind, like my gut goes to how is that tissue gonna get loaded, right? Like when you're looking at like the medial longitudinal arch, the more supination type forces you're gonna get, more like think but more like knee valgus classical movement, you're getting a lot more loading through that. Like that's the load in my mind is resisting that medial longitudinal arch is a lot more of that kind of pronation, yeah, not supination, sorry, pronation of the foot and that kind of valgus. Like that in my mind is where the MLA's primary function is keeping that foot up from having the ankle dump inwards.
Yeah.
Whereas the transverse is more the other direction, where it's keeping the foot kind of helping, especially like more dorsiflexion, plantar flexion type stuff, providing more stability in that sense to the foot. So one's operating on one axis, the other seems to be operating a bit of the other axis. Now, to your point, together, they're both functioning to provide that stability, that force transfer. Like you can't just have one, they both are working together. I
And
think
that would
there
be
is
my thought.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's ways like, and we can get into this a little bit more in the training episode that we do, but I think there are ways you could bias your training towards one or the other, right? It's no different than what you see in certain research around like the quadriceps, the knee, or the hamstrings, where it's okay, all these hamstring or quad exercises target all the different muscles. They all work, but you can slightly bias sort of muscular recruitment or demand of individual muscles by adjusting constraints to the movement you're doing. And in my mind, my gut is telling me you can do similar with the foot of I can bias my constraints to affect this section a little bit more than maybe this section.
Yeah. Cause I'm thinking like if we want to use sprinting as an example of kind of both of those with this, the way the foot moves,
Yeah.
right? We know we get a rolling of the foot. It, to the naked eye, you see somebody hit the ground in high velocity sprinting, and it just looks like like they're on and off the ground, flat-footed, boom, done.
Yeah.
But if you watch it in slow motion, there's a roll of the foot
Yeah.
kind of in the transverse, and there's a roll from the foot in terms of like the forefoot back to the heel, and then there's pop off the ground. So there's, to me, there would seem to be in the foot there is both a level of stiffness that's needed and compliance, kind of like tendons.
Yeah.
There's a happy medium. It needs to be able to deform enough to absorb force, but then stiffen enough in order to transmit force. And so that's where I'm thinking they they likely have to work together, because if you only focused on one aspect of the arch for stability, depending on the movement you're doing, you may be missing out on potential benefits. And to your point about muscles working together but then being biased towards certain things, you look at like the hamstring group.
Yeah.
And again, if we look at sprinting, semitendinosus has the highest velocities,
Yeah.
but semimembranosus, I think it's membranosus, produces the most force. And then biceps femoris deals with absorbing the most force. So yeah, the hamstrings are all working together, but like you said, you can bias them in certain ways. Perhaps foot research and training isn't far enough along.
No.
And like you said, it's 10 times more complicated than the hamstring, for example, which is just 3 tissues and that's the end of it. So maybe we're not there yet to be able to start pinpointing, hey, this muscle in the foot is more important for keeping the structure. This muscle in the foot is more important for producing force, etc. But my initial thought is they would work together, but it was a reading that paper, again, as theoretical as it was and very far removed from training, it did get me thinking, are we thinking about both kind of aspects or all planes and directions of the arch of the foot? Because I think a lot of times we just think of the arch of the foot from kind of heel to toe
Yeah.
or in line with the length of the foot. We don't think about how it arches the other way as well.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the whole compliance thing because it's so easy to get. And we have this conversation on like tendon stiffness, for example, where everyone goes, "Oh, the stiffer the tendon, the better," because it's gonna be a stiffer elastic band. It's gonna give you more spring. You'll be more elastic, like you'll just be more reactive off the ground, and it's sort of like that. Everyone just runs with it, but you
Yeah,
forget the
catch
nuance of
all,
like,
stiff, good,
yeah.
done.
But if the tendon's too stiff and the muscle can't stretch the tendon, then you're pooched.
Yeah,
Similar sort of idea. Like I'm in the it's the Body Movable is a book I referenced a lot for this. And just
okay.
it's a deep dive into anatomy and function. It's essentially the book is. And they brought this idea of, okay, these certain joints in the foot and the ankle are really tightly packed. So like the navicular, the calcaneus, the talus, and a couple other bones in the foot where they're really high, dense, close compaction. There's not much space between the joints. And in the book, they're discussing like this provides stiffness to support the MLA. But then it talked about the splaying of the metatarsals and
Yeah,
how the
they
metatarsals will splay and
diverge.
move to provide some of the compliance of the foot. And that sort of interaction between, again, enough compliance that the foot just isn't a concrete brick, but not too much compliance that's no longer able to transmit force that we talked about, super important. And then the interrelation between those two. Because as the foot splays and expands and pronates more, that does have a benefit. You're going to get more range of motion out the ankle. So it's interesting as I worked through this and looked at different sports, you almost see like arch characteristics a little bit in my mind, or if you dive deep, you might. Because I think about my background combat sports. You're spending a lot of time in these kind of kneeling crouch positions with really deep ankle and knee range of motion. A lot of people have really flat feet in combat sports. That's pretty common. I remember this conversation that came out. The GOTA group coming in of like, oh, you need these perfect arches and these feet and this foot needs to function. And Kier, one of the
The
biggest,
legend himself.
yeah, the biggest critic of these guys came out. I don't know if you know the name Kamaru Usman by example.
No.
So he's no longer the champion. He's recently lost his belt, but he broke some records and was coming close to reaching a status where like he might be the best 170-pound fighter. Like the conversation was starting to happen where he could upset Georges St. Pierre in terms of legacy. He didn't quite get there. He came just short, but the argument was there, like it existed. But he has this externally rotated foot and these really, really flat feet. So in that argument, you go like that, oh my God, he's got terrible feet. He's super pronated. He's got these awful feet, awful ankles. But when you look at a guy whose primarily style is wrestling and really deep foot range of motion, angle range of motion, it's actually probably highly advantageous for him. He doesn't have this excess stiffness preventing him from getting into those deep ranges of motion. That's going to help him execute double legs and single legs and these deep kind of crouched sort of on all four positions.
And combat sports is another example of, I feel like at the start I was very careful to say usually, or 99% of our movements are locomotion through the foot.
Yeah.
That's an example of a sport where there's probably a lot of postures and positions where you are splitting weight
Yeah.
and load bearing between the hands, the upper body, and the
And the
feet and the
foot.
lower body, because there's rolling, there's ground contact, there's things like that. And so again, it's one of these things where, like you said, the function of the foot kind of needs to meet the demands versus, yeah, if you look at somebody who runs a lot, the arch is usually or someone who runs well, the arch is usually well developed and,
Yeah.
very robust. And then you see people that run a lot that are hurt or banged up, and then they have flat feet. And then you're like, okay, well, now this starts to make sense where it's like, yeah, okay, if you got, big old flat feet, that's probably not going to be, it's like running with flippers,
Yeah.
right? I mean, swimming would be another interesting one to look at the foot because it would behave very differently underwater, for example. But yeah, it is interesting because, like you said, I think we're biased towards the stiffness. But like you
Yeah.
said, there is to me at least, there's a balance of both that you need. And when I looked at a lot of the papers that were talking about the function of the foot, we've talked a lot about the anatomy of how it's built, how it's structured, but then how does that anatomy, as you're alluding to now, actually function? It's that the foot isn't it's thought of as like rigid,
Yeah.
when in reality it's not. And even from a research perspective, it's thought of as rigid.
Oh yeah.
Um, like the one paper I was looking at was discussing how so many biomechanical models assume the foot is rigid. And we talk about, biomechanics being, the study of physics for the human body. And the reason we need biomechanics is because the body is not a rigid structure, right? We don't operate like, two pool balls interacting on a pool table and, energy in, energy out, whatever. We are elastic, kind of compliant living creatures, and therefore the way that we interact with physics is different because of that. But then there's so many papers that just assume the foot as rigid. And I've been guilty of this now because going back and looking at a lot of the sprint research that I've gone over and how important the foot and the ankle is. But it's probably been overstated in some ways because it's assuming the foot is rigid. So then it's overcompensating for the amount of work or power or net joint moments or whatever metric they're using being overestimated at the foot, or sorry, at the ankle, because they're assuming the foot is rigid. And if the foot, we know that it's not completely rigid, that probably takes some of the stress off of the ankle. And if we truly wanted to look at, kind of the biomechanical overview, it's what's happening at the hip, what's happening at the knee, what's happening at the ankle, and what's happening at the foot. But
Yeah.
the foot's really complicated. It's tricky to measure. So we just go, nah, whatever.
Yeah.
Assume it's rigid. And then we get these overestimations potentially. So that was an interesting thing from that. It's this Kessler paper from 2020 where I was like, it got me to go back and look at some of the sprint research from before. And I'm like, man, I think I've made some, you know, I've been led astray a little bit about how, again, not that the ankle isn't important, but the ankle is important in conjunction with the foot. And so, yeah, but it's interesting that you're talking about that because the foot is not entirely rigid.
No.
It's got the balance.
Well, it adds nuance to the conversation, right? Like again, the ankle is super important in sprinting, but it's the nuance of knowing that's not the catch-all of sprinting, right? Like there's something beyond the ankle that's actually playing just as big of a role. If you look at some like the correlational studies, some of the variance studies of the foot, depending on what the movement is, foot strength can, I think, what was it, like 25 to 45% or 50% of variance in
Yeah,
certain
that was
movements can be
from
explained by foot strength.
the French researcher. His name, I'm drawing a blank on his name now.
Delize? Doesn't sound
He
right.
wrote the Sportsmith article that came out
Um,
last year.
Roman was his first name. I remember his
Yeah,
first
yeah,
name,
yeah.
Roman. I can't remember his last name,
Yes,
but yeah, like
yes.
same idea.
He
Huge
had
amount of
written,
variation.
yeah,
So if you're looking at the papers you're discussing, where it's, hey, this is the net joint moment of the ankle, but we ignore the foot. That has some
Yeah, like it almost
significant
leads me
knock-on
to
effects.
believe, like the assumption in general is like, hey, it's about 20% at the hip, it's 20% at the knee, and 60% at the ankle. Well, is it maybe actually 20% at the hip, 20% at the knee, 30 at the ankle, 30 at the foot?
Yeah.
Um, which again means there's a lot more probably going on at the foot and the ankle than there is upstream at the knee and the hip. But it gets you to go, oh, ankle super important. Foot, what is that?
Yeah.
When this is maybe a more balanced approach to think about that, because yeah, the foot is definitely a structure that, at least with the some of the research I was looking at, there is a degree of compliance and there's a degree of stiffness. It's not a completely rigid structure. It has, like we talked about in the anatomy, has anatomy set up to create some deformation, but also create some stiffness
Yeah.
that's needed to transmit force. And we know this through other structures of the body,
Yeah.
right? Like the hamstring, the calf, the Achilles, things like that, where there's a degree of compliance and there's a degree of stiffness in order to transmit force and velocity into the activities we're doing.
When you see it across, like the gastroc is more of a velocity-driven movement, right? Like its role is force transfer. Whereas the soleus's role is more active range of motion movement, right? Like the monoarticular versus biarticular muscle function. Same with the hamstring.
Yeah.
Similar sort of ideas where it's, hey, like there's a difference between muscles, even though they're performing hip extension, the hamstring is functioning very differently than the glutes in
Oh,
terms
big
of
time.
their role, right? Like some are more around movement driven, more around force transfer. Because that force again, like has to get back down to the foot. And the thing I found really interesting going on in the conversation, like, yeah, we're not looking at the foot because the foot motion's hard to figure what's going on. The Lauren Chu study that he did with Torstein, I
Yeah.
thought was really interesting out of Edmonton there. Shout back to our U of A days.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was interesting because they're looking at the different moments of the foot and the toe going through the ankle of how you perform a calf raise. And some of you just sit there and go like, oh, like that actually makes sense. Like even though a 20-degree inclined step versus just a plate where you do a calf raise to get more range of motion to the ankle actually creates a pretty profound change in like the muscle recruitment and the net joint moments at the foot and at the ankle because the range of
And
motion is different.
exactly. Yeah. And it's not, like you said, it's not the same.
No,
And I think if I recall, I haven't gone back and reviewed that paper yet. I think it was what, 22 degrees was the optimal.
he was in the 20-degree range. Yeah,
Yeah, it was low 20, something like that. So you think like you said, oh, it's just 20 degrees. What's the big deal? But that 20 degrees could be the difference between maximizing the adaptation at in the extrinsic muscles and the soleus, gastroc, things like that, versus, just getting like a whatever decent,
yeah,
adaptation. So you just, hey, if you're going to throw heel raises in there, you might as well prop the foot up 20, 22, 24 degrees, whatever the paper said, and
yeah.
do it that way.
Well, in my mind, if you're going to do 3 to 5 sets, accumulate volumes of around 50 to 80 reps on the foot. If there's a 15 to 20% difference in net joint moment and muscle recruitment,
It's a big difference
that adds
over
up
all the
after a
reps.
long time, right?
Yeah.
Like after, 50, 100 reps day after day, thousands of reps after years, like that, there's some knock-on effect. In my mind, there's knock-on effects of that. So if you're going to decline heel raises, yeah, it's silly not to do it on a slant board versus just a plate that you use to get an extra couple inches of range of motion at the ankle, right?
And
Like,
I completely agree. It adds up. It's like, Kevin from The Office, many little time make big time.
yeah,
Like you don't think, oh, it's a small amount of time. It's not that important. But when you look at it over the course of days and weeks and years, you go, oh, that was a lot of time I used productively or unproductively. Like you said, if you can get 15% more from a rep and you do 50 reps a week, multiply that by 48 to 50 training weeks a year, that could be the equivalent of doing like it could be the equivalent of adding X number of exercises to every training session.
yeah,
But people would be like, oh yeah, we'll add more to do more. Like that, yeah, yeah. Like that would be good. It's
yeah,
like, well, no, here's how we can do this more efficiently and get more out of it. And like you said, it shows the relationship between
yeah.
everything that's going on, that the foot does matter, because as soon as you change the position of the foot, you're changing how the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles that act on the foot are actually
Yeah.
functioning. So we should be taking something like that into account
Well,
because
if you
that
connect
function
it,
matters.
Yeah, well, if you connect the dots from that study, so he talks a lot about like the length tension relationship. Whereas as you dorsiflex the foot and the toes specifically, you actually hit the plateau of the length tension relationship. Like you're leaving the ascending arm and getting more to the plateau. That makes sense because you think about horizontally driven movements, especially accelerations or broad jumps. When you look at the research, that stuff is way more correlated or has way more impact when you're looking at foot strength versus vertically driven movements, like just like a counter movement jump. But if you look at the foot position, because you're producing force more horizontally of the ground, your foot's entering kind of that toe dorsiflex position. So it actually makes a lot of sense when you start connecting the dots of, okay, we get more foot recruitment when the toes are dorsiflexed. Things that are horizontally driven are highly correlated with foot strength than things that are vertically driven. And look at the foot positions. Oh, they're way more on that length tension relationship because when you're horizontally pushing your toe, like it, you start looking down the rabbit hole and connecting the dots, and it makes a lot of sense.
And no different with sprinting. There is
Yep.
more ankle in lower ex lower velocity early acceleration phases of the
Yep.
run than there is upright. But again, if you look at the position of the foot, that makes sense. Like you're not really striking and yeah, there is a toe on, toe off, but you contact the ground very differently out of the blocks, early acceleration, low velocity scenarios than you do very fast upright running. And so it makes sense now where, like you said, you start looking at, okay, yeah, the foot and the ankle is more active early on in a run than it is later.
Yep.
And it would probably make sense that it would have more variance in terms of if you have strong feet or your foot is very good at dealing with the compliance to absorb and the stiffness to transmit, that you might do a better job accelerating early on in a run than someone who doesn't.
Yep. When it comes back to that conversation, and we can get into this more a little bit, but if you're not training the foot that way, but that's what they have to do in their sport. Like we're just doing calf races till the cows come home. We're not actually ever putting that foot in an overloaded position with dorsiflex toes.
Yeah, and now this is going down the rabbit. This is like
Yeah.
literally a thought that's just popped into my mind. Anecdotally, what I've noticed, the Nike bubble spike. Are you familiar with? I forget what it's
Not
called. It's
as much.
the Max Fly or something like I should probably know, but it's the Nike track spike with a bubble in it. I've noticed a lot of people have a tough time getting into the blocks, probably because
Mm,
it restricts how much you can move through the toe. And the feedback I've gotten from a lot of people is they feel really good upright later on in the run, but they don't feel quite as good early on in acceleration. And now I'm thinking this was more anecdotally noticing like, okay, does it not allow people to get set in the blocks the right way? But you'd think that the Nike engineers would have looked at that to no end, but maybe not. Who knows? I don't know. I wasn't part of the development of the shoe. But now it's kind of making sense if that bubble, given where it is on the shoe, if it's restricting the ability for the foot to move the digits, is that why you're seeing people kind of report being like, it feels a little clunky at the start, but then once I'm upright and I'm moving, the bubble feels real good because then the bubble helps you with that vertical force production, but maybe it's not allowing the foot and the toes to get into a good position for block clearance and early acceleration. I don't know. That's just a random thought in
yeah.
terms of function, but it would come back to again, how does the foot function? And like you said, the toes need to be able to move. The as soon as you change one aspect of the foot, you're changing a lot of things that are happening at the foot, the ankle, the low leg. It's all it's all connected.
Well, that's a tough one because I've heard similar conversations around like the super shoes when they first came out. And again, we have a bias towards stiffness. And the bubble shows that a little bit. There's a bit of a bias towards just really, really stiff feet and ankles. But I remember talking to some very, very experienced coaches when the super shoes first came out, and they're saying, "Yeah, like we've got some concern around stress fractures because they're so stiff and they're transmitting so much force,
It's almost
like that,
unnatural.
almost unnatural because there's so little compliance that that spike in ground reaction force is going to get even more pronounced." Which there could be some knock-on effects when you're looking at stress fractures, shin issues, shin splints, like those types, like stress type injuries and stress reactions. So it's interesting talk about that with the bubble. Yeah, if the bubble's too stiff, you can't get the compliance in the foot position. It's interesting to see how that could potentially affect, especially if someone's an acceleration-based athlete. Like that's where they excel. They're more of a pusher versus an upright, bouncy, elastic, like an Andre Grass type. It's interesting to see how that could very negatively affect their ability to do what they do well.
Or if you're in a sport that requires running, but you're changing direction more, so you're more frequently
Yeah,
dealing with deceleration, reacceleration, deceleration, reacceleration, and you're not kind of getting up to speed and cruising. That again, that the ability to be in that position with the foot would be vastly more important than an upright running athlete,
yeah,
where it's maybe not quite as um, what's it called, quite as relevant. And yeah, like in it's that balance. Like this other one I was looking at was how foot stiffness changes the, again, kind of relation to the paper from Dr. Chu and Torstein, where if you change the stiffness of the foot or modulate the stiffness of the foot, what happens to the muscle activity of the low leg?
yeah,
And typically, if you increase the stiffness at the level of the foot, you get more soleus or gastroc activation when you are walking or running. And so, like to me, it's another sign that the foot and the low leg and the ankle are all connected together in terms of how they move. But I bet you if they in that study just kept cranking up the stiffness, they were putting plates in shoes to
yeah,
create the stiffness as people were doing stuff. I bet you there my guess is there would have to be a point of diminishing returns
yeah.
where the foot stiffness becomes so great that you're now losing out on, like you said, the compliance component of it. So I think again, this paper was kind of advocating for, just looking at how can we change the muscle activity of the low leg based on the stiffness of the foot. Um, but that, along with another paper that was looking at deformation and stiffness of the foot, they had both kind of come to the conclusion that the muscles intrinsically in the foot tend to act how they described as quasi isometrically.
Yeah.
So again, this idea that you want enough stiffness to transmit force, but enough compliance to deform and basically recycle the energy that you're getting from the ground. And again, there's probably a happy balance. So that was interesting because as soon as it said the muscles act kind of quasi isometrically, again, that gets me thinking, okay, midfoot, bridge, things like that. Maybe we need to bias the training more towards those types of muscle actions and maybe in the toe and the digits, because you're getting different ranges of motion and you're moving through, we maybe need to train that. I don't want to say more traditionally, but you have some concentric, you have some eccentric, you deal with all the different types of muscle actions because at least at this stage it appears there are some different functions within different structures of the foot based on what they do.
Well, that's an interesting point you bring up of like the stiffer the foot gets, the more muscle activation and muscle recruitment you're getting at the calf.
Mhm.
Because again, that puts me down that line of thought that if you're familiar with Keith Barr's really recent stuff, where he's talking about, again, very similar function of the Achilles tendon, where if the Achilles tendon gets too stiff or the hamstring tendons get too stiff and they start to out stiffen the muscle belly, then
Not
you
good.
run the risk of getting muscle belly injuries, right? Like that's when you see hamstring strains and calf strains and things like that, is because the muscle can't actually stretch the tendon anymore because this tendon is stiffer than the muscle. So you're getting these big eccentric muscle contractions in the muscle because the tendon's stretching the muscle's not stretching the tendon.
Yeah, the
My
value
mind
of
is,
the force that you need to move the tendon
yeah,
is higher than the force that the muscle can create effectively.
but my mind goes of like, there's potentially a world in which you could assess the foot to figure out the same thing. Because again, the foot gets, again, obsession with stiffness of the foot. If the foot gets too stiff, that could um, potentially create a similar issue, or because the foot's gotten so stiff, you've lost that compliance that pulls the impulse a little bit longer, right? Because the stiffer we get, the tighter the impulse curves get with the really high spikes in force. We might lose some of that buffering from the impulse that protects muscle from getting these strains. So there's a world where someone's foot is so stiff, they're gonna have issues with maybe calf pulls, potentially. Hypothetical, obviously, but
Well, but I think you're right because again, this is showing the connection between the two. And if stiffening the foot creates higher tension up the chain,
yeah,
y- you would assume it's not necessarily a linear relationship, meaning that if you increase the stiffness of the foot by X unit, the muscle activation goes up by X unit. But it's clear that there is a relationship that the
yeah.
stiffer you make the foot, the more the low leg needs to work. And what you're referring to is there a breaking point, which I imagine there definitely is a breaking point. It's the human body. It has limits. And yeah, where is that limit? Like where does it lie? Maybe we haven't got there yet because we haven't maybe we'll never get there because we won't drive the obsession for foot stiffness that far.
Yeah.
Like there's already research now that's coming out that's maybe pulling things, you know, back in. Um, but yeah, those were interesting to look at. Um, again, because similar to the study of getting more activation, I mean, yeah, that probably balances. Like I do want to have the athletes maybe running in stiffer shoes and spikes because I am going to get better,
Yeah.
like more activation and adaptation at the level of the low leg. But that might come at the cost of, foot deformation, compliance, elasticity. So, it begs the question of is there value of, we tend to have, at least in track, okay, you start in flats and you progress towards spikes as you get moving faster and faster, but is there value to, kind of, I don't want to say balancing your training year round, but at least having minimum dosages of like, hey, even day one, we could have spikes on and do 5 or 10 meter acceleration to get the stiffness in the foot to help develop the low leg. But then even in competition, where we're almost only wearing spikes for the training that we do, we need to be disciplined enough and know we need to do at least a minimum dosage in flats to maintain, train, and expose the foot to that ability to deform. Again, that's just an idea that I'm having around the function of that, where if both of those things matter, do you need a minimum, like I said, a minimum dosage of compliance based work and stiffness based work?
It makes sense in my mind. You have this conversation with especially younger coaches all the time where they go, okay, very linear periodization, block periodization type approach of like, okay, it's general prep, it's hypertrophy phase, whatever you want to call it. They just do bodybuilding stuff for 6 weeks and don't do anything that remotely looks athletic.
Yeah.
And they go, oh, well, it's a hypertrophy phase. Why would I jump? Why would I sprint? Why would I throw? And you go, well, because you can't not do that stuff for 6 to 12 weeks and lose it,
And
right?
come
Like,
back bigger than you were before.
and come back bigger than you were before it. Like the idea
That's
that
a
you're just going to
terrible
let that
combo.
not only like the adaptations deteriorate, but also the skill of the movements deteriorate is it's a little bit mind boggling as more experienced coach. You sit there and go like, how would you just not jump for 12 weeks and expect to come back and just be better because you did all this general prep stuff before, right? Like, so in my mind, the idea of periodizing the shoe, for lack of a better term, and having minimum effective doses of it year round of both intuitively makes sense. That's a part of my weight room stuff. We're always jumping, we're always throwing, we're always sprinting. Just the amount of what we're doing changes. We never take it out though.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't know if you'd probably have to look deeper into the shoes and what they actually do and things like that. But again, just from a general, you know, perspective that I think it's everything kind of has a benefit and a drawback.
Yeah.
And it's, well, how can I balance everything that I'm doing to maximize the benefits of things, but minimize the
Yeah.
drawback that's associated with those. And maybe the benefit of flat or more like softer shoe running is you'll get greater compliance of the foot. And the benefit of the stiff racing shoe is that you will get greater activation of, lower limb, like low leg muscles, and you're you're kind of artificially creating the stiffness of the foot. You're
Yeah.
not actively producing it. So again, maybe there's like again balancing those two things and seeing this is the benefit of one, this is the benefit of the other. If I can use both of them effectively, I can kind of minimize the drawbacks in general. because again, I think if there's anything I've learned from going through this stuff is that the foot is like a lot of the other tendinous, you know, muscle tendon type structures in the body. It's a balance between compliant enough and stiff enough.
Yeah.
And I think our training should reflect the the anatomical function of the foot in that way as best we can with what we know to the stage, because it is a, like you said, it's not that sexy. It's not a like well looked at, well researched. There's not a lot of people who know a lot about the foot.
And it's only sexy in certain populations.
Yeah.
And and I think what you're saying is it's tough. It's tough. Gotta drop it a little bit in there. We're talking about
Absolutely.
feet. Gotta satisfy some of the listeners. Um, but like you said, it's tough to figure out like what's compliant enough and what's stiff enough because the research is just not there, right? I think Roman, the guy who wrote that Sportsmith article, is
Yeah.
definitely someone in the world that's kind of being a bit on the cutting edge of trying to not quantify, but just describe these things a lot more of what's enough and what's too little and what's too much. And how do we assess that, right? When you look at assessment of things, it's so all over the place and it's so just hooey and different. Like everyone assesses it differently. The Roman article did a good job of here's a couple ways to assess these few things. I did some PD with Jeremy Shepard a couple of weeks ago, and it was all around the athletic ankle. So coincidentally tied in really well to this conversation that we're having now. But he just talked about some of the things he looks at. And he's like, we don't really quantify much. He's like, I'll look at how they move qualitatively. So we'll do like some calf raise stuff. He's like, when I get into doing calf raises and calf walks and things like that, I'll just watch them. He's like, me seeing them is assessment. That's objective. Like I can see how you move. He's like, I want to see if they have a bias towards being on the outer digits or maybe bias towards being on the inside of the toe. He's like, generally speaking, I want them to be relatively balanced, essentially doing all this calf raise type walking movements. He's like, can they just basically control the arch and the toes? So he's talking about, I want to see if can they raise their toes without the big toe? Can they raise the big toe without the other toes? Can they control the splay of the foot? Can they stiffen the arch of the foot? So it was interesting to listen to talk to that. And then he'll do some different assessments of, hey, here's some plantar flexion, some dorsiflexion stuff. He's got reference points where he's like, hey, for an athlete, he works in snowboard mostly, but he's like, for my athletes, I want to see them around here. So typically when I see them below this, there's generally issues. But beyond that, there's not much in terms of hard data to assess what's going on. Like a lot of it's very qualitatively biased.
And I think that's fine. I think qualitative can be just as powerful as quantitative
Yeah.
info. But yeah, I mean, it's good that you bring up kind of the assessment piece, because it can give at least a starting point for people. Like, what do I look at? What do I try to do to at least come up with a system of, do I need more or less at the low leg or the ankle or the foot or something like that? Because like you said, it's kind of far and few between with what we can actually, you know, pick out of that. Like I wouldn't even know where to start.
Yeah.
And if somebody did, X number of heel raises, is that good? Is that bad? Is that high? Is that low? Is 3 more on one side rather than the other? Is that too much of a gap? Is that not enough? Is it depending on how many reps they do? Like, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. And so I think that's good, because it just gives a bit of some sort of a concrete starting point to say, okay, we can start here. And if it doesn't work, we'll go back to there and then try a different direction with it. But we have something to go by, at least in the initial stages, if you wanted to look at that type of stuff and try to quantify it.
Yeah. Well, and something if you got a gut telling you, like this gut feeling of saying, hey, I know there's something weird going on, but I don't really know what this is. Where do I start? At least have a starting point of look for these general things. You see something, try to do something for it, and then assess back. Like it's something so underrated is people just go like, well, how do I know? What do I do to fix this issue versus, hey, this is the issue. You see it. Go do something. come back and see what works. And as you get better and better, and that's what separates it, 'cause you're elite practitioners, like your Dan Paff type practitioners, where he's done that process of like, I see something weird, I'm gonna go do something. I'm gonna come back and see if that weird thing's still there. He's done that process so many times now that he just knows what's going on.
We have enough experience to
Yeah.
draw back on it. Or if you only done it once or twice, there are still probably several scenarios out there that you've never encountered. So you're like, oh yeah, I've never seen this before. But with time and with experience, you can start to narrow down. You experience more of the possibilities that are out there, and then
Yeah.
you're better prepared to. Oh, I've seen this one before.
Yeah. And that's just I think it's assessment bias that we as practitioners tend to have. We want numbers versus take a video,
And
see what it moves, do something, take a video again. Like that's just as quantitative as here's a force plate metric on impulse or rate of force, whatever it is. Right? Like that big toe strength measurement that Roman had in that article was kind of cool. I thought this is an interesting piece, but you don't necessarily need it, right? It's not a you must have to assess the foot kind of thing, but it could help give you some detail on it.
yeah, and if you're more numbers oriented, then that might be helpful for you
Yeah.
in terms of like the way that you best take in and compute and put out information. Where if the numbers in is going to help you put solution out, then that could be good, like a good tool for someone to have. So, is there anything else you want to touch on?
No, I think we covered most of it, to be honest. Like we've done a pretty deep dive in terms of how the foot operates and functions, and obviously we got 2 more episodes to keep getting into the weeds here. Like
Yeah,
there's
like I said, I kind of hit all the points that were on the page, like kind of the key takeaways from the articles I had read. And now, if I get into anything else, I'm going into actually training it and more part two, part three. So I didn't want to add anymore. So I wasn't sure if you had something that like didn't kind of organically come out of the conversation that you're like, oh yeah, let's talk about this real quick before we sign off. But yeah, that was kind of the Cole's notes of what I had from all those different papers.
yeah, the only important thing I can think about before this turns into a 3-hour podcast, Joe Rogan styles around the foot. The only important thing I have to cover on is when you're training the foot, what do you listen to? That's a very important question because it's got to be a little bit different than what you listen to
Oh
when you're
man,
training for sprints.
I don't know if you've got to this yet because it is. I'm guessing by the time this comes out, this will be like a month. Like day of recording, by the time it
Yes.
comes out, it'll be around a month. But I don't know. Have you seen that Daft Punk has put out some of the unreleased stuff that they had?
Did they actually? I didn't know
Oh man,
that.
dude, it's been like a day or two ago.
I
I've
knew
been
they
all over it. Been all over it.
New Daft Punk is the most exciting thing I've heard about in months because
And
they
I don't
broke
even.
up and that crushed my heart.
Oh, and it came out of nowhere too. Came out of nowhere. And I think there was actually an episode we were recording the day of that announcement was made. So then, like, what I shared that day, I was like, man, no more Daft Punk. Like, I've been listening to Daft Punk, but yes, I figured this was the case. There's no way that over the 30 or 35 years they didn't have unreleased things.
Oh,
And what better
always.
time to put it out than when they're no longer working together and they probably go, you know what? Now's the right time, put that out. But yeah, I've been loving listening to that. So Daft Punk is not a new suggestion. I've already suggested on the show, but very, very timely given the time of the recording and that they've released some of this, like I guess stuff that didn't make the cut or things that they were holding on to and planning on releasing later. But yeah, so go give that a listen.
I'll be listening to that right after because I do have Daft Punk is one of the original greats in terms of the genre of music. Like they've been around for so long, it's hard not to love anything they put out. So I'll definitely be checking that out.
Yeah, it's so versatile. So they've worked with so many different artists. They have influenced so many genres of music. They were influenced by some of the legends before that.
Yeah.
Like just, I think they're very. I think they're an important musical or modern musical
Yeah.
duo to electronic to pop to house to like just a wide array of genres. So yeah, I was hyped when I saw that Daft Punk was like, "Yo, here's some more stuff." I'm like, "Done. Give me every unreleased track that you have, and give it all to me right now. I want to listen to it."
Would they have been the first DJs to do the whole helmet thing? Because every DJ wears a helmet now for the most part. Would they be the originals?
Oh,
Did anyone wear helmets before Daft Punk?
or like, yeah, or even just concealed identity.
Yeah. Because now, like Marshmallow, Sick Kick, Dead Mouse, um, like they all wear. It's more common than not to not have some sort of concealed identity.
Yeah, and even for the longest time, like nobody knew who they were. Like nobody had seen them.
Yeah.
So like they could go out to a coffee shop in Paris and nobody would know that it was Daft Punk sitting down having a coffee. As for some of the other, like if I saw Dead Mouse 5 on the street, like I would recognize who he was.
He's a
Dead
whole
Mouse, I
local
know for the
legend now.
record, we've been over this before. We make jokes about Dead Mouse 5. We know it's Dead Mouse. Um, but yeah, that's a good question because I don't know. Because for the longest time, nobody even knew like who they were. And if they went to an award show and collected an award, they went up on stage with the helmets on. They performed all the concert. It wasn't just a like a concert stage act. Like it was everywhere they went in public.
Yeah.
They had the helmets on, and I'm struggling to think of an artist who did that beforehand because there's a lot that do it now.
Pretty common. I'd say probably half the DJs out there have some sort of thing that's
Yeah, well, and
somewhat of that
even in some of the other genres like synthwave, which has an electronic kind of
element.
background, it's not EDM, but it's got an electronic element. I mean, you have a number of artists who work behind digital aliases, or like
Yeah.
Pilot always has a helmet. Ghost, you can't see who he is. The identity is concealed. Carpenter Brute, the identity
Yeah.
is concealed. You don't know who they are. Um, so I don't know. And even in metal, like Ghost BC, for the longest time, nobody knew who was in the band because they were dressing up on stage, and then eventually their identity came out. But I don't know. Maybe there's a metal or rock band I don't know of that would have done like the dress up on stage, but people wouldn't have known who they were. But I'm struggling to think of someone. Daft Punk is definitely one of the like earlier ones of that.
Pioneers of
But
it
yeah,
for sure. Definitely early wave pioneers. Definitely.
yeah. So yeah, Legends. I was super stoked when they had. I was like, oh yes,
Yeah.
give me more Daft Punk. Give me more new Daft Punk I've never heard. So what do you got?
Man, you know what? I've gone back to some old stuff I've listened to recently. I'm back on a bit of a Mord Fustang kick the last
Oh,
couple of weeks.
dude, I forgot about Mord Fustang.
Right?
Yeah,
I've got
great stuff. Great stuff.
the 40-year-old dad in me, in my 27-year-old body, loves the stupid, simple weirdness of just taking the first letters of the first and the last and switching them. Like San Holo. Like
Uh, another fantastic musical group production. But yeah, great stuff
yeah.
from them too.
But yeah,
I
Mord
forgot about
Fustang.
Mord Mustang. I forgot.
I've been just doing like This Is Mord Fusting on Apple Music, and it's great.
Man,
It's got
yeah,
some good tunes out there.
I'm very happy you reminded me of that. I need to go back and listen to some of that.
Yeah, he's got a couple. Like Shakshuka is a song I've been listening to recently. That's a good one.
Yeah.
There's a couple
Electric Dream
out
is a
there.
good one.
Oh, that's a classic. That's
Yeah, just oh yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. I definitely need to go back and listen. I completely forgot about Mord Mustang.
he's underrated.
Completely forgot.
Yeah. I feel like he's a guy like very good DJ in the community and people know about him. But outside EDM community and culture, no one knows who he is. Like
Not
pop
well known.
culture doesn't know who he is.
No.
He's not a Darude Sandstorm where everyone and their dog knows Sandstorm. Like that's
Yeah. Everybody knows that one. Yeah, no, that's a banger of a selection. That's a good pick. I completely forgot about that.
there you go.
Absolutely solid pick.
Okay, I think I need to go hit some Daft Punk now though. That's definitely gonna
Yeah,
be on the
I
list.
know it's like we got to rush off this call and go get the music going here. So, yeah, but I mean, yeah, that was a lot of fun. Great musical selection. Got to talk a little bit about the foot, how it functions, things like that. Really excited to kind of dive into seeing how you started to train the foot and sharing some
Yeah.
ideas on that. I think that'll be really fun in part two. Um, thanks again to the viewers, the listeners, however you're, taking our nonsense in. Appreciate all of you, kind of hanging out with us for this, and looking forward to the next one. If anyone wants to reach out, you can find me at Speed Strength
Yep.
Performance on Instagram, or Coach Proofer
Yep.
uh, on Instagram. If you guys have any questions for us, want us to talk about anything particular, whatever, moving forward, more than happy to field that. So yeah, thanks to everybody, and we'll see you for part 2 later on then.
I'm excited for part 2. We'll get into it here shortly.